Could the New York Mets feature not one, not two, but three Puerto Rican all-star shortstops next season? On this episode of Locked On Mets, I'm going to talk about the prospect of the Mets signing not only Carlos Correa this offseason, but also how that could open the door to getting Javier Báez back on a discount.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So I just wrote a piece for justbaseball.com talking about Carlos Correa's free agency and Javier Báez and how it all relates to the Mets franchise player right now, Francisco Lindor. And the reason why I think the Mets need to consider Carlos Correa as a viable option as well as Javier Báez is the same reason why you could have said the Mets made the right move at the trade deadline. You are trying to build a team in Francisco Lindor's image. I know you might want to say that Jacob deGrom is the best player on the Mets, and he is. And Pete Alonso maybe is the player with the most potential to have an MVP season and carry you. And maybe Pete is the fan favorite. Regardless of all of that, make no mistake about it. This is Francisco Lindor's team. That's what getting a 10-year, $341 million contract does for you. Francisco Lindor is quite literally tied to the Mets franchise longer than some of their top prospects. I mean, Francisco Lindor has a better chance to be a Met in 10 years than Francisco Alvarez. That's just how this works when you sign a deal like that. And his first season was not great, but the Mets were in first place in the first half. They held that position for 90 days, in large part due to Francisco Lindor's defense, his leadership, and of course, Jacob deGrom putting together an MVP first half. That was what made the Mets good in the first half. And then when they lost Lindor and they lost deGrom, the wheels fell off. But when the Mets traded for Javier Báez, the idea was, for one, get an insurance stopgap while Lindor comes back from that injury, and also pair these two best friends together because that's what Lindor wants, and see if you can catch lightning in a bottle. It didn't work entirely. Obviously, the Mets collapsed. They had one of the worst second halves they've ever had in franchise history, especially when you think about the context of where they were in the first half. But still, you look at how those two guys performed, right? Javier Báez and Francisco Lindor. We know that Báez was amazing for the Mets in his short tenure. Cut down on the strikeouts, got more walks, hit for power, had a WRC plus of, 143 during his 2-month stint with the Mets. But what went unnoticed is Francisco Lindor. In September, Lindor was amazing. I mean, was he an MVP? Of course not. It's a month. But he produced at the same level offensively as he did in his best season in 2018. That year, his WRC plus was in the 130s. The only time in his career he's had a WRC plus in the 130s. And again, for those of you not aware, WRC plus is weighted runs created plus, and it is an advanced metric that measures hitters based on a league average of 100. If you're over 120, it's great. If you're in the 130s, I mean, that just tells you how good of a player you can be at that level. So when you're talking about Lindor in September, his WRC plus was 138. He was producing at a great rate, hit 257, 346 on base, 549 slugging, 9 home runs, 25 RBIs over his final 30 games played. I don't think that's a coincidence that Lindor would be at his best when he was most comfortable having fun every day with his best friend up the middle. And that might lead you to say, all right, so bring Báez back. Going to be cheaper than Correa. Correa is already here. You traded a prospect for him. I get it. But if you compare these players, Carlos Correa is better than Javier Báez. Báez is not a player that I want to get tied to for more than 5 years at most. And really, not even that. I would want Báez to come to the Mets on a 3-year contract with an opt-out after year one. That's what I've been talking about on this show. I just am concerned when you talk about a player whose career WRC plus is 103, just above league average, is a very streaky hitter who's stricken out about 30% of the time in his career. That's concerning, okay? And we're talking about a over 3,000 plate appearance sample size. Báez is basically what he's going to be. Maybe you get the best version, like he just did in the second half. Báez could have an MVP season with the Mets. I believe that. He's that type of an offensive player. He could hit 40 bombs in a year, give you great defense, be incredible. But he also can strike out 200 times and be an anchor in your lineup. So you have to find that balance somewhere in the middle there when it comes to signing Javier Baez. Meanwhile, Carlos Correa is coming off a great season, and he is probably the best offensive player of these three shortstops. And that is why I would prioritize signing him over Baez this offseason, especially if it boils down that their markets are somewhat similar. But let's just go through the numbers. All right. Let's talk about how these three shortstops compare to each other because Lindor, he just set that baseline, right? $341 million. But he is also the best of these shortstops despite the down year. You look at his career F4, Francisco Lindor, 32.1. You got Correa's at 25.1 and Baez at 17.5. These guys have played for about the same time. Injuries have limited Correa a little bit more than the others at times, but regardless, you're talking about very similar sample sizes, Lindor being the better player, and most of that's related to the glove. Outs above average is the best defensive metric right now. That's the one that I go to the most. And Francisco Lindor is a shining star in that metric. He is one of two players in all of baseball, they've been recording this since 2016, that have compiled an outs above average for their career over 100. It's him and Nick Ahmed. So Lindor is exceptional defensively. You look at Javier Baez, his outs above average for his career is 77, one of the best marks in baseball. Correa has been up and down with his defense. He got a lot better this past year. For his career, his outs above average is 27. But you look overall, and he is certainly the type of player that could profile at third base if the Mets were to sign him because he's 6'4", got a big arm. He always had that comp to Alex Rodriguez when he came up and won the Rookie of the Year in 2015. So it is almost natural for him to get a massive contract with a New York team. It might be the Mets, it might be the Yankees, where he would transition to third base. Maybe with the Yankees, he gets that opportunity to stay at shortstop. But you go to the offensive numbers. When it comes to home runs, Lindor has the most of the three at 158. Baez has 149. Correa 133. You go to WRC plus for their careers. Francisco Lindor has a career WRC plus of 117. Baez 103. Correa 128. Again, he is the best offensive player of the bunch. So you look at why would he come to the Mets, right? He has the opportunity to maybe get a contract similar to Lindor. He might be shooting for $350 million. A-Rod on a broadcast the other day, who I believe is close to these guys, said that he thinks Correa could be the first $400 million player. I don't know if that's going to happen, but that's where he's going to shoot for, and we'll see what that number ends up falling to. But you look at some of the latest quotes from Correa, and he talks about being disenfranchised with the Astros, that they didn't want him in the offseason. They were scared of a long-term commitment then. Now that my value is at an all-time high, I'm not sure if they can afford me. He's basically talking like he's ready to walk, and he actually was asked about playing on the East Coast, and he did kind of hint toward the fact that he would be very open and willing to go over and play in some pinstripes. And then he said, I didn't say whether it's dark blue or blue and orange as far as the jersey he would maybe go and play for. So he is playing it coy like any free agent should. He's keeping his options open. But I got to imagine there is some draw to playing with Francisco Lindor. And if you can sign Correa to, let's just say, a 7-year, $245 million contract, right? That's 35 a year for 7 years. Maybe he gets an 8th-year option with a $5 million buyout. He gets 250 guaranteed. He'll make more than Lindor annually, and he could hit free agency again at 34. Maybe you throw an opt-out after the 3rd year so he can hit free agency at 30. That's the type of contract I think Correa would consider. Now, you got to see what else his market looks like. Some team might blow you out of the water, but you certainly have to entertain it when you're talking about improving this team because Carlos Correa at third base allows Jeff McNeil to play second. Now your team fits together really nicely. So I think the overall point that I would go into this offseason with is Correa, if you're going to have to give a 9-figure contract to one of these guys, he is the free agent I would target over Baez because you have the greater potential for him to produce year over year offensively, especially again, if it's a long-term deal. Javier Báez, I'm concerned to give him a lot of years because those strikeouts might age really poorly when he gets into his 30s, when he doesn't have quite the same athleticism to catch up to some pitches. Who knows how Baez will age? Whereas Correa, I think, has a better shot at being a above average all-star caliber player for a longer period of time. But then we get to the Death Star version of the Mets, the version where they just spend all of the money, get all of the guys, have the most swag, have the most fun, have the best team possible, and there's Puerto Rico flags all over the stands, and this team just leans in to creating a group in Francisco Lindor's image, and these three best friends, almost like a big three in the NBA, team up to try to win a World Series in New York in the biggest market with a franchise that's chopping at the bits. How would that come together? Well, if you look at the market, you got Marcus Semien coming off a 45 home run season with the Blue Jays. You have Corey Seager and Trevor Story about to hit free agency. Are they coming off their best years? Not necessarily, particularly Story, who had a down year, but they are viable options that teams might be talking with Javier Báez, and they might say, you know what? Let's just get Trevor Story. We'll bring him in, and he could do a lot of the same things as Báez, maybe at a little bit less of a price tag. If the offseason is playing out and Baez is not finding that deal, because I'm not sure if the advanced analytics people love Javier Baez. They love the home runs, but are they going to like the strikeouts and some of the other holes in his game? If you nab Correa first, now you're sitting in the driver's seat with Baez. Now you're sitting at a point where you say, you know what, Javy? There's a lot of shortstops in the market this year. How about we give you a 1-year deal? Big money. 1 year, whatever it is, $30 million. Would he consider it? A year to play with his two best friends? I think it's on the table. I'm not saying this is going to happen, but this is how you could get Javier Baez on your own terms. Because again, a long-term deal scares me with a player that has had such an erratic career where he's up 1 year, down another. So I look at what the Mets are doing, and I believe we're going to see a massive spike in payroll this season. But what you don't want to do is tie yourself into a team that's locked in for way too long. And that's why something like this could be concerning if you're just bending to the whims of Lindor and you're just giving all of these guys $250 million contracts. Now you're getting yourself into some trouble long term. But if you can get Correa on a contract that has an opt out after year 3, and you can get Baez on a contract that's even shorter than that with an opt out after the first year, well, now you can basically maximize 2022 and have a little more flexibility going into the future. Or on the other end of the spectrum, if you only land Correa, again, Jeff McNeil slides back into second. Your infield is still amazing. You got McNeil, Alonso, Correa, and Lindor. That's exceptional. And I think from there, you'd have to build out the rest of your roster. Who knows? Maybe the Mets are going a completely different direction. I saw today there was a report that they're interested in bringing my guy Jonathan VR back. So maybe this is a completely different build where the Mets are going to get VR and scrap together third base again with VR and Davis and Guillorme, and McNeil's going to be back at second. And who knows? Maybe they're trying to sign Starling Marte to replace Michael Conforto out in right field. I don't know what the Mets' plans are. They still got to get a president. But if you want to dream and you want to dream big, and you want to talk about the most entertaining team possible for the 2022 season with Francisco Lindor as the centerpiece, it's having that infield from the 2017 World Baseball Classic Puerto Rican national team together again, making highlights on a nightly basis at Citi Field. It's an exciting thing to think about, and that's what this time of the season is. It's off-season time. We're getting into the hot stove. It's time to dream. And if I'm Steve Cohen, it's a dream I would certainly be considering when it comes to Francisco Lindor's Mets right now and what they should do to capitalize on this window to win right now.